the RTI took an in-depth look at some national research at what it takes to sustain implementation. And what rose to the top were 5 key factors, and they can be found in this sustainability brief. But know that factor 2 of the 5 factors most closely connects to today's content. And it basically could have been the title of this session, but it just was a little too long. But I'm going to read it out loud. Implementation teams are systemic and effective and play an active role in supporting implementation. So that is why we are here talking about effective teaming. We want to be clear around our session outcomes. So today we're going to walk through 4 strategies that we're calling game changers. And by the end of this session, we will land in creating actionable next steps for building and supportive effective implementation teams. Okay, so we start with our why, right? Why do we focus on teams? We know that systems change is hard, complex work. So why is teaming such an important ingredient? Because it's the difference between letting it happen and making it happen. Together, we go further. We know this, and that's what teaming represents. So we always know that just because a bunch of people are put together at a table, it doesn't just make them a team, right? While many schools talk about collaborating, very few actually really collaborate by definition. The more people own the work, the more stickability that innovation has. So just top down does not work. Okay, so we've learned that collaborative cultures lead to improved student achievement. So we're going to go ahead and see what these systemic organizational structures can look like. First, we're going to take a step back. We're going to zoom out before we zoom back in. So I'm just going to pause so that you can take in this graphic. And I want to think back to the sustainability brief. And there's actually another factor that this work also connects to, and that was factor 1. And factor 1 is all about how equitable multi-level system of supports should align to school goals, policies, vision, mission, and other programs. So there's multiple factors from that sustainability brief that connects. Here in this graphic, you can see horizontally all the essential elements of our work, right? And then vertically, you can see the alignment of these essential elements. Okay, so we're not going to dig in super deep into each one of these text boxes, but we just want to give you an overview of what this alignment can look like, should ideally look like. And for our work today, we'll be swooping in at that school level. Okay, so we want you to reflect on how is your school team's work directly aligning to your school's vision, mission, and improvement goals. So we're going to take some time to unpack that. Okay, so the manner in which we want to identify those anchors is through this first activity. So we call this our grounding in our work. And this is a take back activity. So to start our journey, you first need to identify those grounding anchors, right, in order to align your team's work or any team's work. In the resources, you'll see a place to record this information in the blank template. Okay, so it looks like this. You see the screenshot. And this can be referenced for additional guidance later. It's going to come up again later, right? And teams here are prompted to basically cut and paste your homegrown vision, mission, and school improvement goals. And they will serve as what we could call North Stars to be able to really go back to anytime we're wondering, is there alignment here, right? And again, because these activities are completed best, usually within a team, including school leaders and decision makers, we do recommend that this type of activity eventually make it back. So we're calling this a take back, right? So that it can be collectively completed when possible, if possible. And so from there, we're going to go ahead and dig into our implementation team changers, okay? We're going to start with trust. And trust is a standalone as well as embedded into all the other game changers. So for our purposes today, we're going to be using Megan Shannon Moran's definition of trust. She's the author of the book Trust Matters: Leadership for Successful Schools. And she says that trust is the glue that binds followers to leaders and is also the lubricant that keeps communication and team processes running smoothly. She advises that trust is a decision, so that we can either choose to trust or we choose not to trust. And if you don't have trust, you really can't do the rest successfully. So hopefully you'll be able to, we want you to keep trust in the side of your mind as we take in today's content, and we'll also be referencing it throughout. We're gonna dig into this game changer as well. So I'm just gonna take a minute to pause so that you could read this quote. We cannot collaborate without trust, not effectively. We need to understand that trust matters most in situations of interdependence. So an example of interdependence can be the relationship between schools and families. So we ask parents to trust our ability to protect and educate their children that are in our care, right? That's an interdependent relationship, and we need that trust to be able to do our work. And so interdependence inherently brings with it vulnerability. There's a need there, right? So as we continue, we want you to, again, keep this notion, this concept of trust in teams in the forefront of your mind. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move into the role of a team. How is this a game changer? First, we're going to talk about teams, and then we'll talk about what we mean by the role of a team being a game changer, right? So here, we ground in the work of Lencioni and Garmstrom. I'm going to be quiet just for a moment so you can read this. Okay. So we're talking relatively a small group of people, anywhere between 3 and 12. And the next 3 points come from Garmstrom's work, and it really just reminds us that a team's work is not static, and we need to strive to have a healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo, right? That continuous improvement kind of mindset. And finally, Lencioni tells us that we cannot get this done without trust. So we really do need to lean in here. So understanding the role of a team as a game changer, simply put, when a school's leader and team members are able to have a clear understanding of what the work is, what their work is, they can then in turn be more effective at it. So let's see how we can achieve that. First, we need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what the role of a team is, right? Not to be confused with what we would traditionally call a committee. An implementation team is a bit different, and that needs to be clear and transparent, right, and understood by all parties. So when we think about what an implementation team does, we can think team, train, support. What a team needs to do is confidently train and support others, and this starts with building their own capacity in the content that they are leading, right? So that team is that building team capacity so that they can then in turn train and support staff. this many times is a shift from how teams view themselves, or what the type of work that they've done in the past. I personally have worked with teams where I walk through this newer kind of shift of a role of a team, just to be clear and transparent, right? When we're working with teams, this is what we're talking about. And you can just kind of, sense kind of like the little shift in the room, because it's not always a way that we're used to working. And this slide, as well as this newer slide right here that's present, that you can see, they both come from our updated Tier 1 PBIS materials. So any teams that are currently being trained in PBIS Tier 1 actually are walked through some of this content. So just know that it's part of the shifts as we continue to learn and grow around implementation of the PBIS framework and other pieces. This is part of that new learning for us as well. So I'm going to pause so that you can take in some information from this slide here. And essentially, this slide really depicts the different roles that we're looking to be able to have. And really, they're skills, right? They're abilities, skills, expertise that we're looking for the individuals in our team to have, okay? So this is another kind of shift in thinking around moving from a somewhat narrow approach, where just like traditional kind of roles that are dictated by maybe just like grade level representation, or whether content teacher or special ed teacher, yes, that should be taken into consideration, but also we can think even more expansively of what are the skills and abilities that are being brought to the table, right? So this really exemplifies moving from technical to more adaptive elements, right? One that I will zoom in on is the data-based problem-solving strategy. So when we think about data and problem-solving in the past, we could have maybe walked through as far as like who has access to the data, who can bring it to every meeting. And so those technical pieces, we really want to, yes, but also think about strategies that we bring to the table. So for example, there are particular data-based problem-solving strategies that can really help in furthering discussions, or the nature of our discussions, when we think about students from diverse backgrounds and the types of conversations that we're having, so that we can lead to actual productive problem solving and solution development, right? And so we wanted to hear from, we were just curious, what are some things that have resonated with you thus far?
Okay, Tanya said trust is so important, a great foundation to build from. And we have one that says, from Oshkosh, that says teams need to build their capacity before they can train and support their buildings. Kim said, we all talked about how trust is essential, and it may be really challenging to establish trust at the beginning of this school year due to so many uncertainties. Absolutely, Kim. Yulia and I talked a lot about that. Joseph said he loved the definition of trust, especially the inclusion of vulnerability. And Heidi said that trust is a critical component and a choice we have to make as the people at the table.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing some of those, Kathy.
That we have a few more coming in, but that's people are resonating around trust, and we have to have a healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo, Nathan says. He loved that.
So we're going to move into our next game changers. We're going to dig into this notion of what is essential, determining what is essential, especially during these times. And you know, when I heard Amy's keynote yesterday, a lot of it resonated with me as far as thinking about what is it, where is it that we want to put our energy, knowing that it is finite, right? So what do we mean by this? We're talking about absolutely necessary, extremely important. Okay, so the intention of this next game changer is to do just that. We recognize that our energy, our time, our space are finite. So how can we really maneuver ourselves and our team's work to have really that laser-like focus that it needs to have? This is just a quick disclaimer that this particular game changer, we're really going to zoom out a bit, building wide before we zoom back in, which means, again, ideally this type of activity, if it's done systemically, it'll encompass all teams that currently make up your school's problem-solving structure. So that means the best way, ideally, to complete this type of activity would be collaboratively, ideally with input from the team members from each team, and then also administrative support and decision making. If done in its entirety, but pieces of this can be taken and used in chunks as well. So for today, we're going to walk through determining what is essential, and we're going to start with a team that you're on. So we want you to think of a team that you are currently on. Yes, you could think of a team maybe you were on that if you're not on a team, but to make this as meaningful as possible, we hope that it's a team that you can identify that you're on now, and really thinking about this next game changer as well as our last game changer via that lens. Okay, so how can we begin to do this? Our activity first starts into digging in into that blank template resource where we can find activity 1.2, and it's on page 2, right? So first we identify the technical aspects of the team. So we're talking about the team name, individuals on the team, meeting times, etc. So here we want to be able to identify or get a pulse on any patterns that might exist, like in overlaps of individuals or frequency of meetings, etc. In the example template, you can use that as a starting point to see an example of one school and how they zoomed into any teams that had any connection to social, emotional, behavioral kind of content. So they listed 3 teams as in the example template. And so once you list the teams and some of those technical aspects, we want you to go in and really think about what's the current purpose of the team, or like the intended purpose of the team. Whatever kind of discussions are had around the purpose of the team is all of it is valid. So, but being able to get a pulse on that. So here, deep and honest conversations might be had around what the team actually does or creates, and if it really does fulfill the intended purpose. And this might be an area where it needs to be revisited or adjusted as well, right? That might become evident, like we don't know what the purpose is, for example, or something like that. Or what exactly, if we could define the purpose, what would that look like, right? And so once the purpose is identified of these teams, we really want to go back to that first activity where we are aligning, we're making sure that our goals and our doing matches are aligned and really have that laser-like focus. So we want to think about the activity of grounding in our work and identify when we identify the school's vision, mission, school improvement goals, we want to go back to that as an anchor. And we want to take a look at the specific school improvement goals that this team is working towards, okay? If they are, right? And if not, they might need to, that might be up for discussion. We might need to see how directly those connections are aligned, or if they aren't directly aligned, right? So things to think about, and this is just the first part of beginning to determine what are we talking about when we think of essential. Are we, so really identifying which teams do we have at our school that are essential, that we need right now to really move the work forward. So Then we go into um, the next steps, which would be the actual determination, right? So after completing those first three columns, part two in this activity then dives into considering if there might be overlapping content or if that overlap is intentional or not. Okay, so in the example, you'll see in the example template, this school had three particular teams around social emotional behavioral content. So one was the PBIS team. They also had um, a trauma sensitive schools team or trauma informed team, and then they also had a social emotional learning team. Uh, they are all they're all valid in the work that they do. That has nothing to do with determining if the work is important. It is all important, of course, but at the same time, there was some reflection that was able to be made around how directly does it connect to what it is that we say we do here, right? So the PBIS team, it turns out that they have a problem solving, um, digging into data process that they regularly use that connects directly to the improvement, one of the school improvement goals. And you'll see that in the example. Whereas the other two teams, although they do provide PD and training, and were really needed in the first few years of implementation, like the first introductory, this is what social emotional learning is, these are the competencies, etc. That can be important. The standalone kinds of teams can be important at that time, but this team was in year two of that implementation. So you will see that it was determined, the leadership decision was determined that these teams would merge. So we move from gathering that information to decision making. So like mentioned, is there overlapping content? Any other teams? Is it on purpose? Is it not on purpose? And then what leadership decisions need to be made? And right, that might be that there's merging that happens. There might be phasing out. Maybe it's kept as is, but content is shifted. All of those types of conversations could be had at that point. So really, at the end of the day, we are talking about cutting the fat. And in deciding who makes the cut and how those cuts are made, that is where it would be very helpful to have a decision maker being part of this process, right? Stages of team development. So really, we're going to dig in here, and now we're really going to zoom in and think about, yes, that team you're on, or the team that we help to guide, and what are those actionable kind of pieces that we can dig into so that they can be the most effective team as we move forward. So we're gonna, when we take into account the stages of team development, to be able to provide, we need to be able to provide the best just-in-time supports, right? So forming a team, we know, takes time, and members often go through recognizable stages as they change from being a collection of strangers to a united group with a common goal, right? So we're going to be looking at Bruce Tuckman's forming, storming, norming, and performing model to describe these stages. So at each stage, Tuckman shares observable and predictable behaviors of teams as look for. So we're going to walk through those. I think it's important to note that these are normal and they are to be expected. So we need to be able to see these. We're hopefully seeing these, and so to be able to identify what are those supports that are needed, the right type of support and the right amount of support, right, to help teams move through to performing stage. And when you understand it, you'll be able to help your new team become more effective more quickly, and that's pretty important. We also want you to think about how trust develops as we move through the stages. You're going to see those pieces highlighted as well. So we're going to go ahead and dig in, and we're going to start with forming. So you could, we want you to do just a little bit of visualization to start. You could close your eyes, or you could use this visual that we've provided here. And so you want to think about this new team that has just formed. You're part of this new team. And at this stage, some of those observable, recognizable behaviors that you see are that team members, they're usually a little more polite, they're positive. There's some anticipation or excitement about the task that's at hand. Others might have some underlying fears, maybe some suspicion, because we don't really maybe know at this point what exactly lies ahead. There's many wonders, and for some people that might mean that there might be some complaining or some impatience. This is all normal. And this is an early stage where team members they're just tentatively attached to the team. There just isn't much to grab onto at this point. So because of this lack of understanding and experience in this work, teams might have difficulty identifying relevant problems, right? They're just too new to the work. And so this stage can last for some time. And as people work together and they make an effort to get to know each other, to get to know their colleagues in new ways, as a leader, you would play a dominant role in this stage, or leaders play a dominant role in this stage. It's because team members' roles and responsibilities, they just aren't clear yet, and they need to be made clear, right? This is why the team's why needs to be established, right? So here are some of those needs that teams can be guided through. And here you'll see supports that can lubricate the forming stage. So some activities, they're similar to the one that we shared earlier in this session that help ground the teams in their work. Making sure that the team understands how their work aligns to the school mission, vision, and goals, and clearly establishing their purpose to get to know how they can help and get their teamwork on track, right? Establishing roles and norms are also really important elements for the team so that they can later, when productive conflict ensues, they can then use those to fall back on. Okay. And so, this is really full circle around understanding the role of the team. Does the team clearly understand their role? Has that been established? Has that been defined? Has that been shared? That can all help during this forming stage, at any stage, but forming is where it mostly lives and would be most effective. All right, so we wanted you to think about that team, and that team has now had some time to form, and now they go into the storming stage. So before, the visual was more, you saw the leader up leading, right? Everyone else was sitting, they were listening, they were being guided. So here in the storming stage, it's a little bit of a pivot, but still the leader plays a pretty dominant role because storming is where people start to push some of those boundaries that have been established in the forming stage. You might see some norms violations happening because they're just kind of trying to see what is it that we do here. And it's a really fragile time in a team's evolution because it's a messy kind of phase. So some may question the worth of the team's goals, and they might even resist taking some tasks on. So for example, some team members may even challenge your authority or jockey for positions as their roles are clarified. Or if you haven't defined clearly what the team work will be, people might feel overwhelmed by their workload. And they could feel uncomfortable with the approaches that are being used. Unrealistic goals could lead to feelings of lack of progress. And some may start to lose interest or even opt out. This can all lead to frustration. So it's just important, we go back to, I think about my toddler, and I think about how defiance is something that is normal and I need to look for, even though it can be frustrating. So this storming stage, very similarly, can be uncomfortable, but yet it is so normal in team stage development. So here, some helpful pieces, some needs would be conflict resolution kinds of strategies, building knowledge around styles, style differences, right? And fostering interpersonal relationships. that can really help a team move past this phase with like less battle scars, if you will. And some leadership techniques really come in the form of listening, coaching, being approachable, giving answers, because again, that leader is still someone, sorry here, is still someone that's taking a pretty dominant role. And so you can picture the leadership still maybe working in small groups of people, maybe some one-on-ones, but there's still a good amount of deciding because the team isn't quite a fully formed team yet. So with the right supports, the team can move into the norming stage. And this is when people start to resolve some of their differences, really appreciate their colleagues' strengths, and begin to respect your authority more as a leader because they have established procedures, there's more open communication, there's more participation, and overall there's more trust. So now that your team members, they know each other a little bit better, they may socialize together more authentically. They may be able to ask each other questions or for help, provide constructive feedback to each other. People develop stronger commitment to the team goals, and you start to see some good progress during this stage. So what leadership can look like is that, well, during team meetings, a leader is more sitting at the table, like everyone is working together and no longer taking that much more dominant role in leading. So we can't necessarily easily identify the positional leader, right? Because the team at this point is more interdependent. And the leader is applying coaching and listening skills, but we see more shared decision-making that is encouraged and supported. So do know that often a prolonged overlap between storming and norming can occur because as new tasks come up, the team may lapse back into behavior from norming, from the storming stage. So I think that kind of, that brings me back memories from a team that I was on that really, it seemed to live in storming for almost like 2 years because we would go from norming to storming, norming from storming, and we were just, it was kind of exhausting, but that it made sense when this information was taken in as far as that being something that happens to a number of teams if those supports that are needed aren't provided, right? And the team reaches to performing stage when the hard work leads without friction to the achievement of the team's goals. They start to see those successes, and the structures and processes that have been put into place, that have been set up, they support the team's work well. So there is a higher commitment, there's high trust, and it's maybe even led to some genuine friendships, which can be great. As a leader, you can delegate much of the work, and you can even concentrate on more developing team members. It can feel a little easier to be part of this kind of team at this stage. It can even be fun, exciting, since the sense of flow and pride, satisfaction are now what's palpable, right? There's an understanding of each other's styles, and there's more flexibility and creativity. There's a balance of risk-taking with mutual support. And so at this stage, teams, they do need a way to measure their performance, right? We'll keep with our high standards, so they need to know what that looks like and moving towards it. They also need support and confirmation so that they can continue to perform effectively and efficiently. And what leadership roles can look like at this stage is more of a delegating task, but also, they still need to be observed and monitored as a group from time to time. And leaders can support a performing team using non-directive leadership skills, like as well as setting goals with them and allowing the team to establish them. So in my experience before I joined a team that was just kind of like maneuvering from storming to norming, I had a prior experience with a performing team. And so I was personally grateful for that experience, because there's a true difference in the feeling of being part of a performing team. Like it's a beautiful thing, really. So we do want to make sure that we're putting in the supports that are needed to be able to lead up to a performing team as quickly as possible. So this is this is a particular site that's in part in some of our other trainings, and it's the title is basically "It's like this until it isn't," right? So here are some additional things that we want to think about, especially considering our current context. So when we think of the role of the team, what are those voices that might be missing to ensure that our work is meaningful, culturally responsive? So what do we need to do differently to maybe to ensure that barriers are removed, maybe barriers that have been there before that we're now identifying live there that we maybe didn't realize? How will those be removed so that we can have those voices that we need at the table? Keeping in mind the abrupt school closures that happened in the spring, what might be new ways that teams need to be supported? As we move to new ways of working, what teaming processes may need to be revised or adjusted to match these new formats? And as we move into the fall, there continue to be many unknowns of what exactly the year will hold. So how will the health of the team be fostered? Teams want to be productive. How might they need to be supported differently so that they can be positioned to be productive? So especially we go full circle back to that trust piece, right? And especially in these trying times, if we're able to focus in on what is in our locus of control and influence, then we can really all step up to the plate within our abilities for our students, right? So at the end of the day, each of us play a role on the teams that we're on, right? We each play our part in either building or possibly eroding the trust that is needed to move teams through the stages of development, as well as towards being healthy and productive. So we want you to think about how we choose to show up. And it really goes back to what Amy was sharing yesterday around self-care and really being able to be there for ourselves in that way so that we can then in turn be there for our teams who are there for our students, right? So here are some behaviors that do fall inside of our locus of control. These are things that we can do to build our teams up. Okay, so they don't have to be grandiose. They don't have to be these huge, massive things that we take on, right? These are small, little things that we can do on the day-to-day or at a meeting that are really inside of that locus of influence or control that we need to go back to or be able to go back to during these times. So the bases are loaded, and so we want you to consider today's implementation team game changers as we roll into our last culminating kind of activity. So finally, in the action planning for effective teams, you're going to find in that template a place to be able to examine the stages of team development. So and we'll show a screenshot of it in just a moment, but in that portion of the blank template, you'll see that the teams, we dig into identifying what is the stage of that team's development. What are some action steps that can be taken to improve that team's effectiveness? And then there's some just logistical pieces, because we know when we're able to identify those action plans, it's more likely for them to be followed through. So who, when, what are those actionable kinds of steps? What can they look like? And then how will we know? How will progress be measured? And so here's just that screenshot of what the template looks like in blank template resource and know that in the example template resource, there you can see how that school maneuvered. They ended up merging teams, identifying where the team was, forming because it was a new team that had been merged, and then some of the decisions and action steps that they chose to put into place so that they could move the team from forming to storming, which sounds kind of funny, but we do want to make progress, and the next step would be storming. Thank you everyone for your attention. We're really excited to be able to share this information today. We have our contact information on the last page, last slide, as well as at the beginning. So if any other questions come up around this information, we'd love to be able to continue those conversations.